The third of these organization constraints we're going to talk about are resource constraints. This has to do with the kind of the money, the power, what are the things as an organization that you actually have control over? Because an individual has control over a certain amount of things, but we know organizations together have control over much, much more. And when organizations bring these things together, namely money, political capital, knowledge, expertise, they become very, very powerful. And so this power, to what extent does it allow us to do things that are innovative or not? And so some of the resource constraints I want to talk about in a moment is we're going to talk about whether you have enough resources of the kind you need to innovate, whether you have the right kind. There may be one kind that you need and you have another. Also the volatility of those resources, how the resource amounts go up or down as we go through time in our organizations. Organizations also may force us to use the resources only in very specific ways, legitimate ways, and that may stop us from innovating. And then also, we may give individuals very little control over the resources in the organization, which may lead us to not having power to do different things with them. So let's look at these each in a little bit more detail. Having insufficient resources, it may be that we don't, even small amounts of resources, that we don't give people control over. In large organizations, you have to make sure the organization doesn't make big mistakes, and so you may give people small amounts of resources, but we need to understand that that leads us to not being able to innovate, that we may have small projects to do, and if people say, well, I can't even get $100 or $50 from my organization to try this out, why should I use my own money to try this out? And so sometimes we don't give the resources. There may be good reasons why we don't give the resources. Maybe we don't have them. It may be that we have to use them in certain ways by law. For example, if I have a loan covenant, that is if I have money that I'm using to run my business from a bank, they have requirements about how I use that money. And so that may create insufficient resources for certain kinds of things I do. I may also have the wrong kind of resource. I may have lots of money but no time or no people. And so here's another thing where I potentially have the resource but don't have the right resources that I need. So sometimes we don't think about what are the resources required for innovation. We may think about money. We may think about do I have the equipment? Do I have these things? But there may be some other kinds of resources that we need. Time, for example. We're going to talk a great deal about time constraints later in the 7th week of the course when we talk about technological constraints. But for now, think of time as a resource for an organization, and how do we use that? How do we create that? How do we schedule that? We also have this issue of getting the right people for the right job. We may need new kinds of knowledge. So if we are trying to move our product into a new market, maybe we need some knowledge of that market. So where do we get that knowledge from? We can't always create the knowledge ourselves, and maybe we need to find that in other people outside. Often there's the hiring systems that we might use in our organization. So if I have an organization, I want some new knowledge in there, the way I hire people may be the way that I currently hire people. Think about GM and the electric car. So for them to do the electric car means that they have to hire different kinds of people than they used to. They might used to hire combustion engineers and mechanical engineers and people who know about those kinds of things, whereas now they might have to start hiring electrical engineers and people who understand electric motors. And there may be some subtle incompatibilities between that. We're really good at doing one. We know the universities where we can hire these. We know how to get them. We know what they know. Whereas these electrical engineers on cars, it's like we don't know where to find them. Where do we find them? How do we know they know what they know? And these kind of real subtle difficulties in getting the resources, that is the people inside of our organization, can get in the way of us being able to move, to implement, to execute our innovation that we're trying to do. And so again, these new kinds of people may be hard to bring in, and so we really need to be thinking about how it is we're going to move ourselves through. We have another problem of resource volatility, that sometimes the resources we have may be gone quickly. If you are in a publicly owned company, where there's a stock for your company, then the stock price may cause you to have more resources available or fewer resources available. So as that thing goes up and down, it may cause us to not have the resources we thought we had in order to innovate with. And if we have fewer resources, people become more risk averse, organizations become more risk averse, and so there will be less of it spent on doing this thing called innovation. Then we've got this problem called budgets. I've always been puzzled. It's always sort of struck me as interesting that we have to do budgets in advance. Because, for I am remember the R's and A's, I'm a strong R, as you can probably tell. I I know what I did after the fact. It's really hard to know ahead of time what I'm going to do. And so when there's a requirement that I budget something, it becomes really difficult. I always think we should budget after the fact. We should say, okay, well, what did you spend last year, instead of, well, moving forward. Because a lot of innovation, if you think about it, is stuff that's going to happen. And we often don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know how much it's going to work. One thing you might do is and we'll talk about this a little bit more in what things that we can do, is leave some money in your budget for experimentation. But some people don't like that, especially if your company is very much wants to be in control. Remember last time we talked about control. If your company wants to keep that kind of control, it may be very difficult for them to be willing to give up control over the budget. Because budget is power, and so some people want that power even at the cost of allowing innovation to happen inside their organizations. We have this thing called value chain constraints. And so a value chain is the set of steps of things that an organization does to raw inputs in order to create valued outputs at the end. And so if I have a company that brings trees in on one side and puts lumber out on the other side, then there's a value chain of value adding steps that we do. We may take off the bark, we cut it into things, we package it, and we put some insecticide on it, and then we get it to customers where they need it. And so those steps are the value chains in that organization. So one thing that happens in organizations have a value chain. And probably if it's a good organization and it's currently functioning well, the value chain works. And so what's going to be hard is for someone to say, well, wow, you have an idea for how to mess this thing up. It already works. Why would we do that? The value chain functions, so why should I make changes to it? So that's something we want to be aware of, that when we propose changes, there may be a set of steps that work, and people say, why would we make those changes? Another problem with this is that we may have a value chain and we're not sure how it actually works. Right? That maybe we don't understand where the flows are, we don't understand exactly how it is that we add value. Like we think that we're adding value here, but we're actually adding value here. And this happens actually, that organizations don't really understand what people value in what they do, and they lose their way. So I'll give you just a concrete example. Kodak, for example, at a point in its life, did not understand that the value was not in making film, but the value was giving people instant access to their photographs. And so the digital camera makers understood that, whereas the filmmakers at Kodak did not understand that. They were never able to sort of envision how it is that they could create value in this domain called photography. There's value chain may create resource contentions, and we say this part of the value chain is very important, this part's less important, so let's give them more resources. So even if there's an innovation that could happen over here, this part of the organization gets many more resources because that part of the value chain, the way that they add value, is perceived to be more important. And so there's contention across the chain, and so we have to decide where we're going to allocate resources, and this can lead us to that kind of problem, that kind of contention. And to sum this up, I would sort of think of the idea that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that is a common mantra in some organizations to say, look, things work pretty well, okay. Like, why are you rocking the boat? Why do you think you need to fix this? Well, we innovators, we have ideas by why we need to fix things, and so we have to really answer this question and be aware that people understand our value chain to be working and that we don't want it to be broken. So, resources. We've talked about resources now, and so what's the problem with resources? The problem is getting the capital, the resource, where it's needed. And so in organizations, because organizations are big, because organizations are spread out, because control is differentially spread in an organization, it's hard to get the resources where they need to be. We may have differential access. Some people have access and other people don't. And that's right, because maybe the strategy is to do a marketing strategy, to have a marketing strategy and not to have an operational strategy. So marketing may get more money to build the brand. And so there's that differential access. Budgets are about the future, they're not about the present. And so to get things, to create innovations that are responsive to what we're going through now, we had to have predicted that a year ago or 5 years ago, depending on when the budget was made. And if we weren't a very good predictor of the future, which most of us aren't, it was hard to know that we should have put a certain amount of money aside in order to address that thing. Also, in some organizations, many organizations, with respect to resources, you're asked to anticipate the return before you start. So they say, I'll go in and say, hey, I have this great idea, I want to work on this innovation project. And they say, well, what's the ROI on that? If I give you $1, how many dollars are you going to give me back? I say, well, I don't know yet. And they say, okay, well, come back when you can tell us. Well, how can I tell you unless I go through the experiment of doing it? And so we end up in this sort of stuck place, in this place where we're not moving forward because of the requirements of return, of how we measure capital. And then also, innovation may go against ideas of just routine functioning. That some organizations, they just want to do what they do, and they're happy doing that, and they should not do anything else, and those organizations are not ones that are set up for innovation. They want routine functioning, they want the same outputs, they want things going the same way every time. So, with these kind of problems, what can we do? How can we overcome resource constraints? Well, to overcome resource constraints, we have a few ideas here. One idea is thinking about starving or feeding innovation. So there's one idea that you starve innovation, that is that you give people very few resources, that makes them resourceful, and they start thinking of new ways of doing things. They come up with new ideas and new breakthroughs. But we also know that some things just take a lot of money, right? That, you know, when the atomic bomb project was going, there were like the equivalent of today's like billions of dollars were put into that, and that was required. It would not have happened unless they were able to have those resources. And so what does that mean? That means that we can't just sort of turn our brain off and sort of stupidly throw money or keep money or throw money or give money back, or that we really have to understand what's going on, what kind of innovation is this, does this require resources? Are resources, money is what's going to move it along, or is there some other resources? Is it time? Look, this project's not moving ahead, but it's not because they don't have money, it's because they don't have enough time. And so this feeding and starving that is putting resources in or out, we need to be able to have flexibility to be able to do that. And that takes us back to the structure about being flexible and being ready to shift resources as needed inside the organization. Another one is about ignoring the ROI. And again, as I'll say again and again, not every organization needs to innovate, and not every innovative organization needs to innovate every time. But when you're trying to seek innovation, you have to ignore the ROI. Because up front, especially in the early stages of the project, you may not understand, you may not know what the return is. You have to generate information, and if you can't pull out of your efficiency seeking thing long enough to do the early stage testing, the early stage explorations for what the return might be, you're never going to get there. And so if we can make it more about learning, what's the, you know, what are you going to learn by doing this project? I'll give you this money, but what are you going to learn by doing this project? If it works, what do you learn? If it doesn't work, what do you learn? Well, if it works, I'll learn what the ROI is. If it doesn't work, I'll learn we should never do this. And so in organizations, if organizations could get around making it about learning and not just about return, that's how we're going to overcome these kind of resource constraints. Next, we want to think about the sort of, I call them sort of resources that are committed to certain kinds of innovation. So I had a friend, he was an industrial engineer, and early in his career he worked for a company, and his company made diapers. And so one day they took him to the diaper machine room when he was early in his career, and they said, oh, look at this machine. The machine probably as big as a room, as big as a house, and it's just, you know, all these materials going in and diapers are coming out of the end, all folded up nicely, these sort of disposable diapers. And he's like, wow, like that's really cool. And he was a new industrial engineer, so he thought, like, you know, I could make this more efficient. If I made this like 2% more efficient, like we could get like 10 million more diapers out per year, you know, whatever the number was. And he said what happened was a senior person in the organization came up to him and said, you see that machine? That's the last you'll see of it, and walked him away and said, never think about that machine. Don't even touch that machine, because if you mess that machine up, we're going to lose a whole month worth of production. And so don't even touch that machine. And so that kind of facility where he could try out his ideas, where he could get his ideas to work before trying them on the big machine, would be great. And we call that a pilot plant, right? We call that prototype facilities. But many organizations, they don't want to have a pilot plant that would be sitting idle a lot of the time. And say, well, that's not productive to have that thing sitting there, not producing what it needs to produce. Well, you're not going to get innovation unless you have those kind of resources available for people in your organization. And then finally, the value chain. So we talked about value chains, about how value is added through different steps. We really need to understand what our value chain is, how our company creates value, like the things that we do, how they add value, and which of those things are worthy of innovation, we should pay lots of attention to, and which of these things are the ones that truly create value for us, right? The ones that are important that we pay attention to and that create value. And so those, we need to say, if this thing really creates value in this organization, people are going to be sensitive about it. And so if I propose a change to it, I need to have that understanding that stakeholders will push back and say, hey, wait a minute, that's an important part of our organization. But also, then you can use it to justify what you're trying to do. Say, look, this is such an important part of our organization. If we had more efficiency here, we're creating more value. If we have a lot of efficiency over there, that's fine, but it's not making our bottom line, making our reason for being, right, our mission better, because this one that creates lots of value is. And so that's where we want to think about our value chains and understand how do they work and how is it that we make changes to them in ways that make sense. So that's it about resource constraints. So we've talked about strategy constraints, we've talked about structure constraints, and we've talked about resource constraints in the organization. So hopefully you've seen how this is a different way of looking at the problem of innovation. So this is the way of looking at the problem of, what I call the problem of execution. That organizations are required to execute innovations. So again, we have the idea, that's the individual. We have the group that gels it, makes it into an innovation. Then we have the organization that is able to execute this thing, to make it really happen. And so for it to happen, the organization has to be set up to overcome these kind of constraints to be able to make that work in a new way inside that organization. Now I want to just tell you a little bit more about measuring innovation in organizations and ways that we might be able to push for more innovation in our organizations in legitimate ways.